The unexpected rejection. Kenny walked confidently through the busy airport, his uniform pressed neatly, his boots polished to a shine. He had served his country proudly, rising through the ranks of the military with honor. Today was supposed to be a simple journey home, a short flight, a seat in first class, and some quiet time to relax before he saw his family again. He had saved for this moment, booking a first-class ticket weeks ago. It wasn't just about the comfort. It was about giving himself a well-earned break after months of training and missions. He imagined how it would feel to sit back in the plush seat, the flight attendants offering him a drink, the world outside fading away as he let the stress slip from his shoulders. As Kenny approached the check-in counter, a friendly woman greeted him with a smile. She looked at his ticket and typed something into the computer, her fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. "Mr. Williams, your seat is ready. Just head to gate B12, she said, handing him his boarding pass. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in her eyes, an odd look that Kenny couldn't quite place. It was subtle, but it made him pause. She quickly turned her attention to the next person in line, as if nothing had happened. Kenny shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was probably just tired. He had been on many flights before, and this was no different, or so he thought. When he reached gate B12, he found a small crowd gathered. The gate agent was standing behind a podium, speaking to a few passengers. Kenny approached, ready to board the plane. "Excuse me," Kenny said, showing his boarding pass. "I'm ready for my seat." The gate agent looked at him, then down at his ticket, and then back at him. Her smile was gone. "Mr. Williams, I'm afraid your seat has been reassigned." Kenny froze. He thought he misheard her. "What do you mean reassigned?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The agent cleared her throat and glanced at the computer screen again. "It appears that your first-class seat has been given to another passenger. You've been moved to economy." Kenny felt a rush of confusion and frustration. "What? That doesn't make any sense. I paid for first class, and now you're telling me I'm in economy." His voice started to rise despite himself. She looked apologetically at him. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's nothing I can do. You'll need to take your seat in the back." Kenny's heart began to race. He didn't understand what was going on. This wasn't just a mistake. It felt deliberate. He had reserved this seat for weeks. Why was he being treated like this? "Are you saying I don't deserve to sit in first class?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. The agent remained silent, avoiding his gaze. It was clear she wasn't going to offer any explanation. Kenny had no choice but to take his new seat. He turned and walked down the jet bridge, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, but he didn't care. When he boarded the plane, he was greeted by the flight attendants. They smiled warmly and directed him to his seat in economy. It wasn't the same as before. This wasn't the seat he had paid for. This wasn't the seat he had earned. Kenny squeezed into the cramped space, trying to ignore the growing anger in his chest. He had been through a lot in his life, but this was different. He had never felt more humiliated. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, he sat back in his seat, staring out the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the seat. There was something more behind this. He tried to calm himself, reminding himself that it was just a seat on a plane. But the feeling of injustice kept bubbling up inside him. Why had this happened? Who made this decision? And why did it feel so personal? That's when he noticed someone sitting across the aisle, staring at him. The man looked ordinary enough, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses, but there was something strange about the way he was watching Kenny. It was as though he knew something Kenny didn't. Kenny's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? Why was he watching him so intently? The man didn't seem to be looking at anyone else, only Kenny. Kenny turned his attention back to the window, trying to shake the unsettling feeling in his stomach. But he couldn't ignore the fact that something about this situation felt far bigger than just a misplaced seat. As the plane took off, Kenny tried to focus on the flight, But his mind kept returning to the question. Why was he being treated this way? Was it just a mistake, or was there something more at play? He had no answers, but one thing was clear: this wasn't the end. Something had started, and Kenny knew he couldn't let it go. The injustice he felt was too strong to ignore. The flight continued, but Kenny's thoughts raced. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. And little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would reveal secrets he never could have imagined. As the plane soared through the skies, Kenny sat in silence, his mind made up. He would find out the truth, and when he did, it would change everything. The mysterious passenger. Kenny's thoughts buzzed as the plane soared higher into the sky. The world outside the window looked peaceful, but inside, everything felt off. His chest tightened with each passing minute. The rejection, the reassignment of his seat. It all felt like a deliberate act. But why? And who was the person behind it? His eyes scanned the cabin, landing on the mysterious man across the aisle. The man was still sitting there, his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying Kenny closely. Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. The man didn't move a muscle, didn't speak a word. Yet there was something unsettling about his presence. Kenny tried to focus on the flight, but his gaze kept drifting back to the man. The stranger had dark sunglasses perched on his nose, even though the cabin lights were dimmed for the flight. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. It was as if he didn't belong on this flight. There was an aura of mystery around him. The longer Kenny stared, the more the feeling grew. Something wasn't right. It was more than just the seat mix-up. This was something deeper, something more personal. Finally, the man shifted in his seat, and Kenny's heart skipped a beat. The stranger didn't glance at him or acknowledge the stare, but instead, he pulled out a small, sleek black briefcase from under his seat. He opened it slowly, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. But to Kenny, every move he made felt calculated, deliberate. Kenny shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What was in that briefcase? Why did the man seem so calm in the face of such a strange situation? The flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, but Kenny couldn't focus on any of it. His mind kept returning to the mystery. Who was this man? And why was he so focused on Kenny? Was he connected to the seat reassignment? Or was it just a coincidence? After what seemed like an eternity, the plane reached cruising altitude. The lights dimmed further, and most passengers settled in for the rest of the flight. But Kenny couldn't relax. His mind was on high alert, scanning for any sign of the truth. He wanted answers, and he was determined to find them. As the man across from him sat back in his seat, his briefcase now closed and resting on his lap, Kenny took a deep breath. The flight felt endless, the minutes stretching out as if the plane would never land. He kept his eyes on the stranger, unable to shake the feeling that this was all leading to something big. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke. His voice was smooth and calm, cutting through the silence of the cabin. "I see you're not happy with your seat," he said, his eyes glinting behind the sunglasses. Kenny was caught off guard. He hadn't expected the man to speak to him, let alone acknowledge the tension between them. I'm fine," Kenny replied, his voice tight. He couldn't bring himself to trust the stranger enough to tell him how angry and confused he really was. The man didn't seem to care about Kenny's reluctance. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Kenny's eyes. "I know what you're thinking," the man said quietly. "You're wondering why you're sitting back here instead of in first class, aren't you?" Kenny froze. How did the man know what he was thinking? His heart began to pound harder. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and it was becoming harder to ignore. "You should stop thinking about it," the man continued, his voice still low. "It's not as simple as you think. There's more going on here than you realize." Kenny's eyes widened. More. What did he mean? Was this all part of some larger scheme? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Before he could respond, The man sat back in his seat, his sunglasses still hiding his eyes. "Just trust me," he added, his tone final, as though he had already said all he needed to. Kenny stared at the man, stunned. Was this some sort of warning? A cryptic message? Or was the man just playing games with him? His instincts told him that there was something more to this situation than a simple seat reassignment. He couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. "There's more going on here than you realize." It was clear that the stranger knew something important. But what? What did this all mean? The flight continued, but for Kenny, time seemed to stretch endlessly. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. What started as a simple flight home was quickly becoming a journey into something far more mysterious. Kenny leaned back in his seat, trying to calm his racing thoughts. But the man's words echoed in his mind. "There's more going on here than you realize." Kenny couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. Was it just a coincidence, or was something much bigger unfolding right in front of him? One thing was for certain. This flight would not be the peaceful escape he had imagined. As the hours passed, Kenny's thoughts spiraled, and he realized that he might not be able to escape the strange turn of events. The mysterious passenger had started something, and Kenny had no choice but to follow it through. A new revelation. The hours passed, but Kenny's mind remained far from the calm, restful state most passengers had slipped into. He couldn't stop thinking about the man's cryptic words. "There's more going on here than you realize." He kept replaying the moment over and over in his head, trying to make sense of it all. Why had the stranger singled him out? What was the connection between the seat issue and the mysterious passenger? Kenny glanced over at the man again, who seemed completely calm and detached from the unfolding drama. The stranger hadn't moved an inch, and his sunglasses still covered his eyes, making it impossible to read his expression. But despite the calm exterior, something about him felt like a ticking clock, the second hand moving relentlessly toward an unknown event. Kenny couldn't keep his eyes off him. There was something unsettling about the man, something deeper than just his cryptic words. He was certain this wasn't a coincidence. The rejection of his seat, the strange encounter, everything felt interconnected. Suddenly, the plane hit some turbulence, and the seatbelt sign came on. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, and the atmosphere inside the cabin grew tense. Kenny's heart raced as the plane jolted again, the sound of rattling overhead compartments amplifying the unease. As the plane steadied, Kenny looked back at the mysterious man. This time, their eyes briefly met. It was the first time since they'd boarded that the stranger had removed his sunglasses, and when he looked at Kenny, it was with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Brace yourself," the man whispered just loud enough for Kenny to hear. His voice was calm, almost comforting, but there was a deeper layer of something else in it, something Kenny couldn't quite place. Kenny's mind raced. Was this man warning him about the turbulence, or was he referring to something else? Before Kenny could ask, the man turned away and settled back into his seat. The moment felt surreal. Kenny wasn't sure what to do with the information he had. He looked around at the other passengers. No one seemed to notice the strange tension between him and the man. Most were simply going about their business, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the deeper mystery unfolding within the confines of the airplane. But Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. There was no logical reason for the man to know so much about him, and his strange warnings were becoming harder to ignore. A few minutes later, the flight attendants began their round of beverage service. As they approached, Kenny's eyes flitted to the stranger once again. This time, the man had his briefcase open, his fingers gently tracing the edges of a small document that appeared to be a flight manifest of some sort. Kenny felt his curiosity grow. What was he looking at, and why did he seem so focused on it? Could this document be related to the mystery? Kenny's mind was racing, his desire to understand the situation building. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront the stranger again. What if he was making it all up? What if there was no connection? He decided to take a risk. He shifted in his seat, his heart pounding as he stood up to use the restroom. His path took him directly past the man's row, and as he did, he managed to steal a glance at the document the stranger was examining. His stomach flipped. There, at the top of the page, was a name, Kenny Thompson. How was that possible? Was this a mistake? Or was it intentional? His name was on that document, but why? He quickly averted his eyes and hurried toward the restroom, his mind a blur of confusion. As he entered the cramped space of the airplane bathroom, Kenny tried to calm his breathing. His mind was in a whirlwind. He was no longer just a passenger on a flight. He had become part of something much larger, something that made no sense. His name was on that document, and the mysterious passenger seemed to know more about him than he had initially realized. What did all of this mean? Why was his name listed on a flight manifest that didn't match his ticket? Was this part of a bigger plan? Kenny felt as though he was on the brink of discovering something monumental, but the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered. Taking a deep breath, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore what had just happened. Something was going on, and it was tied to him. But the question was, what was it? Kenny stepped out of the bathroom, his thoughts still clouded, but now with an overwhelming sense of urgency. The mystery had deepened. The stranger's warnings, the document with his name on it, and the strange turn of events had thrown him into a spiral of questions. As he walked back to his seat, he realized that there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead was far beyond a simple seating error or an odd encounter with a fellow passenger. Something was unfolding, something that could change everything. And he was right in the middle of it. The unseen hand. Kenny returned to his seat, his mind racing with the realization that his name had been on that mysterious document. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more urgent than the last. As he sat back down, the plane seemed quieter, almost too quiet, as if the hum of the engines was trying to drown out the storm inside his mind. He glanced at the mysterious passenger again, but this time, he wasn't just a curious bystander anymore. The man, still seated calmly with his briefcase open, was a puzzle that Kenny couldn't ignore. There was something about him, a knowing look, an aura of certainty that made Kenny feel like he was part of something far larger than a simple flight from one city to another. The plane suddenly jolted again, reminding Kenny of the turbulence earlier. This time, though, the jolt felt different. He felt like something was coming. The cabin seemed to grow colder, and as if on cue, the man closed his briefcase. It was done. His posture shifted ever so slightly, a subtle but significant change that made Kenny feel as if the man was preparing for something. Kenny tried to focus on the flight attendants, still offering drinks, moving up and down the aisles. But every time his gaze shifted toward the mysterious man, the chill returned. The unease gnawed at him. What did the stranger know? How was his name on that document? Was it a mistake or something more? And just as Kenny thought he might snap, the man spoke again, his voice low and calm, just above a whisper. "They won't let you out of this, you know." Kenny froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with meaning. He swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to turn and look away. The man's tone was so calm, almost soothing, but the words felt like a warning. "What do you mean?" Kenny asked before he could stop himself. His voice came out too quickly, too urgently. The stranger didn't look at him but continued to stare ahead, as if he were watching something unseen. "They've already started. The game has begun. You're in it now." Kenny's heart pounded. Game? What game? He hadn't signed up for any kind of game. He was just a soldier on his way back home. But the man was speaking as though he were part of some deeper truth, something Kenny hadn't yet grasped. His mind scrambled for answers, but no matter how fast he tried to think, he couldn't make sense of it. "Who are you?" Kenny asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, but it wasn't one of reassurance. It was almost mocking, like he found the question amusing. "You'll know soon enough." Kenny wanted to ask more, but before he could speak, a sudden announcement interrupted. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We're preparing for a slight change in altitude. Thank you. Kenny's breath caught in his throat as the plane dipped slightly, causing a ripple of nervous energy to flow through the cabin. The smooth hum of the engines changed, and the air seemed heavier. He glanced around the cabin once more, searching for anything, any clue that could explain the odd, unsettling atmosphere. Most passengers had returned to their own worlds, lost in books or screens, oblivious to the strange tension in the air. But Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The man had made it clear that he knew more than he was letting on, and now Kenny was caught in a web of uncertainty, unsure of who to trust or what to believe. His heart rate quickened as the seatbelt sign flashed on again. The flight attendants moved swiftly, reminding passengers to buckle in. Kenny didn't pay attention to the instructions. His eyes were locked on the man, who now seemed even more enigmatic than before. Kenny felt as though the man was observing him, waiting for him to make the next move. But Kenny couldn't act. Not yet. He didn't know where to begin. The stranger had spoken in riddles, and it felt like every answer led to more questions. But as the plane continued its strange descent, Kenny realized something important. There was no going back now. He had been thrust into something he didn't understand, and the only thing he could do was hold on and wait. He had no choice but to follow this strange path, wherever it led. Suddenly, Kenny's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hoping for some distraction, anything to help ground him in reality. But when he unlocked it, he saw an alert pop up on the screen. An encrypted message. It was from an unknown sender. The message was short. "We know who you are. You can't hide anymore. Don't trust anyone." Kenny's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook as he stared at the screen. It was all starting to make sense. The mystery, the stranger, the document with his name, and now this message. It was all connected. He felt the weight of the moment, knowing that he was being drawn deeper into a world he hadn't even known existed. There was no turning back now. The unraveling truth. Kenny sat back in his seat, his mind racing. The encrypted message on his phone lingered in his thoughts, repeating in his head like a drumbeat he couldn't ignore. "We know who you are. You can't hide anymore. Don't trust anyone." He tried to steady his breath, but it felt like the walls of the plane were closing in on him. The man across the aisle, the one who had sparked all this confusion, remained eerily calm. His expression hadn't changed. His gaze was still fixed ahead, as if nothing unusual had happened. But Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that this man was somehow connected to everything. The message, the document, the strange words spoken just moments ago, it was all pointing to him. He had to know more. Without thinking, Kenny slid out of his seat and made his way to the bathroom at the back of the plane. He needed a moment to himself to process everything. As he walked through the narrow aisle, he couldn't help but glance at the man once more. This time, their eyes met. For a brief second, Kenny thought he saw a flicker of something like recognition. But the man quickly turned away. Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. Had the man been watching him all along? Was he part of this strange game? The questions flooded his mind, but he couldn't answer any of them. Not yet. He needed to find out who this man was and what he had to do with everything that was happening. Inside the bathroom, Kenny locked the door and leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths. His mind was a whirlwind, thoughts colliding with one another, each one more urgent than the last. What was going on? Who was behind all of this? The message on his phone still flashed in his mind, taunting him. He had to figure out who was pulling the strings. But as he stood there, staring at his reflection in the mirror, he realized something that made his stomach drop. He didn't know who to trust. The message said not to trust anyone, but could he even trust himself? Just then, there was a knock on the bathroom door. "Sir," a flight attendant called from the other side. "Is everything okay in there?" Kenny froze. He hadn't realized how long he'd been inside, but the last thing he wanted was to attract attention. He quickly opened the door, trying to appear calm. "Yeah, just a bit of turbulence," he said, offering a forced smile. The flight attendant nodded and stepped aside to let him pass. Kenny walked back down the aisle, his mind still racing. But now, something had changed. The tension in the air was palpable. As he returned to his seat, he noticed that the flight attendants were whispering to each other in the galley, casting furtive glances toward the back of the plane. Their behavior seemed off, but Kenny couldn't make sense of it. Were they in on something? Were they working with the stranger? As he sat back down, the man across the aisle glanced at him again. This time, Kenny didn't look away. The stranger's eyes were calculating, as if he was waiting for Kenny to make the next move. It was unsettling, like a game of chess where Kenny had no idea what the next move would be. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice low. Kenny blinked, taken aback by the question. Was he speaking to him? The man had never acknowledged him directly until now. It felt like the calm before a storm, the moment when everything would change. "I'm fine," Kenny replied, his voice steadier than he felt. He couldn't let this man see that he was losing control. Just a bit of jet lag. The stranger's lips twitched into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that said, "I know more than you think." Kenny felt his heart race again. There was something in the air, something about this man that made him feel like the pieces were starting to fall into place. But what did it all mean? Suddenly, the captain's voice came over the intercom, breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The announcement was followed by a jolt that sent a ripple of nervous energy through the cabin. The lights flickered momentarily, and for a brief second, everything felt out of place. Kenny's heart skipped a beat, and the mysterious man's eyes flicked toward him once again. It wasn't just turbulence. It felt like something was about to happen. The plane continued to shake, more violently this time, and the air seemed to grow colder. Kenny couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just an ordinary flight anymore. Something had shifted, something bigger was at play. And just as Kenny began to wonder if he had imagined it all, a flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Everyone, stay calm," she called out. "There's a problem. We need to stay in our seats." The tension in the cabin was thick as the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Kenny's mind raced. What was going on? Why had the flight attendants reacted like this? The man across from him didn't seem concerned. He remained perfectly still, watching everything unfold with cold detachment. Kenny's fingers tightened around the armrest as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. And it had everything to do with him. The tipping point. The plane shook again, harder this time. The flashing seatbelt sign blinked on, causing the passengers to fidget nervously. Kenny's heart pounded in his chest as the sudden turbulence made him feel as if he were stuck in a nightmare. The lights flickered once more, and for a brief moment, the cabin plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, everything had changed. The plane no longer felt like a simple mode of transportation. It felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Kenny's fingers gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something was about to happen. The flight attendants, usually so calm, were now rushing down the aisle in a hurried, almost frantic manner. Their movements were sharp and quick, but there was an underlying panic in their eyes that they were desperately trying to hide. The mysterious man across the aisle, however, didn't seem fazed by the chaos around him. He remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on Kenny, who could feel his stare like a weight pressing on his chest. It was as though the stranger was waiting for something. And then it happened. The intercom crackled to life once again, but this time the captain's voice was unnervingly tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm. Our flight crew is taking the necessary precautions. We will update you shortly." Kenny's pulse raced. Technical difficulties. That was the last thing he wanted to hear in a situation like this. His mind immediately flashed back to the cryptic message he had received earlier. Don't trust anyone. Was this the beginning of whatever had been set in motion? He glanced around the cabin, looking for any sign of reassurance, but there was none. The other passengers were all whispering among themselves, their faces drawn with fear. Some were clutching the arms of their seats, while others were looking toward the emergency exits, as if they could somehow flee from the situation. The flight attendants returned to the galley, but their hurried glances and the way they huddled together whispered of something bigger, something they weren't telling the passengers. Kenny's eyes darted back to the mysterious man, who was still watching him with that same calculating gaze. What was his role in all of this? Kenny's thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang from the cockpit. It was followed by a series of muffled voices, as if someone were trying to communicate through the door. The cabin fell deathly silent, everyone frozen, waiting to understand what was going on. It felt like the air itself had thickened, suffocating them all with the weight of uncertainty. And then the man finally spoke. "You should have listened," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tense silence. Kenny turned to him, his heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his efforts to remain calm. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just a flight. This was never about getting to your destination. It was always about getting you here, to this moment. Kenny's stomach twisted. His mind raced, trying to piece together what the man was saying. What did he mean? And why had this man singled him out? Was this all part of some grand plan? Before he could ask more questions, a sharp jolt rocked the plane. This time, it wasn't just turbulence. It felt different. The sudden, violent shaking sent some passengers into a panic. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and the plane seemed to dip, just slightly, as if it were losing altitude. Kenny's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary turbulence. The flight attendants had already disappeared, their hurried footsteps echoing down the aisle. Something wasn't right. They had never acted like this during a routine flight. His thoughts were interrupted by another voice, this one coming from behind him. A flight attendant, her face pale and wide-eyed, rushed past him and whispered urgently to the man across the aisle. "It's time," she said, almost inaudibly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He turned toward Kenny, his eyes locked onto his. "Get ready," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. Kenny didn't have time to process his words. A sudden lurch threw him forward, and then silence. The plane leveled out, but the stillness was deafening. The engines had quieted, and for the briefest moment, it felt like the world had come to a halt. And then the intercom crackled again. "This is not a drill. Prepare for emergency landing. Please follow all instructions from the crew." The voice was no longer calm. It was filled with urgency. Something was happening. Something big, and Kenny had the eerie feeling that he was caught right in the middle of it. The man across from him moved again, this time heading toward the cockpit. No one stopped him. The flight attendants had all disappeared, and the few remaining passengers were too frightened to do anything. Kenny stood up, his instincts kicking in. He knew he had to find out what was really going on, what secret was unfolding before his eyes, and why had he been chosen. As he took a step toward the cockpit, his foot caught on something, a small envelope tucked under his seat. He bent down and picked it up, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. Inside was a single phrase, written in bold letters. "Trust no one but yourself." The cold realization hit him like a punch in the gut. The secret was unraveling, and he had no idea how deep the conspiracy ran. The final revelation. Kenny's mind raced as he clutched the envelope in his hand. "Trust no one but yourself." The words echoed in his head like a warning he couldn't ignore. He had always been someone who trusted others easily, but now he wasn't so sure. The strange, escalating events on this flight had thrown everything into doubt. The plane was still in the air, but the calm, ordinary nature of the journey seemed a distant memory. Something was definitely off, and he was at the center of it. He turned around quickly, hoping to get a better sense of what was happening. Passengers were still murmuring, but there was a different energy now. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was confusion, uncertainty, and even a hint of panic. Everyone was on edge, and nobody seemed to know what was going on. He scanned the cabin again, looking for the mysterious man. He was nowhere to be seen. Had he gone into the cockpit, or had he slipped away with the flight attendants? Was he involved in this somehow? It was becoming clear to Kenny that everything was connected to him in some way. And this wasn't just a coincidence. The man wasn't just another passenger. He was part of a bigger picture, one that Kenny had unwittingly stepped into. Kenny's grip tightened around the envelope as he tried to make sense of his next steps. He could hear footsteps approaching from the back of the plane. Turning around, he saw a flight attendant, her face pale and her hands trembling. She was moving quickly, and when she saw Kenny, her expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a hushed, urgent tone, glancing around nervously. "It's too late to turn back now." Kenny felt his heart skip a beat. What did she mean by that? He had no time to ask more questions as the flight attendant quickly walked past him, heading toward the front of the plane. The urgency in her voice lingered in the air, leaving Kenny with even more questions than before. His instincts told him to follow, but he hesitated. What if he was walking right into the trap the mysterious man and the flight attendants had set up? What if the secret they were hiding wasn't just about the flight, but something far more sinister? Just as he was about to make a decision, the intercom crackled again. But this time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was deep, distorted, and completely unrecognizable. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight has been rerouted. You are part of a greater plan now. There's no turning back. Prepare yourselves." The words sent a cold shiver down Kenny's spine. The voice seemed to echo throughout the cabin, and for a moment, everything around him felt like it was closing in. The people around him froze, their faces blank with fear and confusion. What was going on? Why was everyone so calm despite the terrifying announcement? Kenny's hands shook as he clutched the envelope, the words, "Trust no one but yourself," still burning in his mind. If there was one thing he knew for sure now, it was that this wasn't just a random event. This was a carefully orchestrated plan, and he had somehow become a part of it. But why? The plane began to dip again, and Kenny's stomach lurched as he felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into his bones. This was no longer just about the flight. It was about survival. He had to get to the bottom of what was happening, and fast. The flight attendants reappeared, this time moving with purpose. They didn't glance at the passengers as they walked down the aisle, their faces set with grim determination. Kenny followed them, his mind spinning. He was getting closer to the truth. He could feel it. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous things became. He reached the galley where the flight attendants had gathered. They were speaking in hushed tones, too low for Kenny to overhear. But one of them, the same attendant who had spoken to him earlier, turned and saw him standing there. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "You need to leave. It's not safe," she whispered, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "If you stay, you won't make it." Before he could respond, the doors to the cockpit flew open, and the mysterious man appeared once again. This time, his presence was commanding. His cold eyes locked onto Kenny, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. "You've come too far," the man said quietly, stepping closer to Kenny. "But I'm afraid there's no turning back now." Kenny felt his blood run cold. Was this man the mastermind behind everything? Had he orchestrated this entire ordeal just for Kenny to uncover the truth? "What do you want from me?" Kenny asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain calm. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. I'm not the one you need to worry about. There's someone much more powerful behind this plan." The sound of the plane's engines cut through the silence as it shuddered again. The mysterious man stepped aside and motioned for Kenny to follow him. He had no choice. The fate of the flight, and perhaps much more, was in his hands now. Kenny took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined to face whatever secrets lay ahead. He wasn't sure if he could trust the man, but he knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The real story was just unfolding, and Kenny was at the center of it all. As he followed the man toward the cockpit, the plane descended once more, the ground growing closer with every passing second. The feeling of inevitability hung heavy in the air. Whatever happened next, Kenny knew he would never be the same again.